Tonight we continue our series of interviews with candidates for a Suffolk County District Attorney. Our guest has worked in the county as an assistant DA as well as in private practice, and we'd like to welcome Linda Champion. Thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you for having me, Chris.
I want to start with your background by having you go back to when you were growing up and your mother, who was a victim of domestic violence. What was that like?
So growing up, my mother was a victim of domestic violence, but my father was in the military. He was a Vietnam War veteran. I think back then they didn't treat Vietnam War veterans with the type of medical care that they would have needed coming back from the war. And it was an interesting time because when we came back my father came back from the war, we were located in Texas. And as you can imagine, living in Texas, a young black man, a Korean wife who didn't speak English, hardly any English, the cultural differences between her and my father and his family, society's view on interracial marriages at that time. I think that it was very complicated. So my father was very abusive to my mother, and thankfully for her, she was able to get out of that situation. A lot of times victims aren't able to move on a different pathway and find avenues to be successful and to raise their children. But for my mom, she was able to do that.
Well, if we fast forward to your work as a prosecutor, let's say you're confronted with some young person who's accused of a violent act, and at the same time you look a little deeper and you see that person too has been victimized. I think there was a young girl you were talking about. Explain why that was so important for you.
So it was so important for me because oftentimes children will cry out for help. So when you experience crime or trauma associated with something like as serious as domestic violence, there's a cry for help. And sometimes people are paying attention, other times people aren't. Sometimes what they do is they just simply label a child as a troublemaker or this is a bad kid. What I want to do is change that conversation. So every child has potential and every child has an opportunity for success. If we find that child in the criminal justice system, the first question I want to ask is, can we redirect this child? Is there another pathway that they can go down to get them out of a pipeline to prison? As you and I both know, as children enter the system, they start to build a record. And once people have this sort of view that this kid is not going to get on the straight and narrow, then I think people often give up on them. Their own support system gives up on them. The school system gives up on them. And so what we really need to do is help kids just navigate themselves back on a pathway to success.
Well, another, maybe a tougher case in a way, is about, let's say you have an 18-year-old who's found with a gun. He has no right to carry that gun, but he hasn't any record of convictions, let alone any violent convictions. So what do you do? Do you go with a mandatory 1.5 years in jail with that kid, or do you say, we got to find another way to deal with this?
Yeah, no. So I don't believe in mandatory minimums. I think that people have to be treated as individuals. I think we need to look at the facts and circumstances for each person before us, and we need to develop a path for that person. For your scenario, an 18-year-old who has no prior record, no history of violent offenses. Sure, I don't want someone carrying a firearm in Suffolk County or anywhere that they don't have a license to carry. However, the question then is, do we put this person on a pathway to being successful, to understanding that people make mistakes, giving them an opportunity for a second chance, redirecting them through a program, a diversion program, or some sort of program that's age appropriate for them so that they understand their action, what the potential consequences of that action is, and they understand that we're willing to work with them to get them on a pathway to success. The reality, though, is if we place a juvenile or a young person on a diversion program, the goal is we don't ever want to see them again. And so our job is to make sure that if they enter the system, we can get them out of the system as quickly, as expeditiously as possible. They can go back to being kids or going to college and building a pathway for their own life.
This is BNN News, and we're talking with Linda Champion, candidate for Suffolk County District Attorney. Linda, you probably heard about that poll done for the Hyams Foundation, and among people of color especially, there was more distrust of the criminal justice system, it seemed, than even for the police department. What do you take away from that?
I take away from that we need to restore the faith in the criminal justice system. People often, I was at a seminar for the ACLU hosted at Harvard University the other night, and he said that I don't refer to this system as a criminal justice system, but as a criminal legal system. And so I think that the onus is on the district attorneys to make sure that if we're looking at and evaluating cases, particularly cases that involve police officers, that if the response to that case is that there's nothing to suggest that a police officer acted in an inappropriate way, that we're not only saying that, but we're having transparency and explaining to the community what the facts and circumstances were, how we arrived at our conclusion, and how we determined what the outcome of this particular case would be. Oftentimes what you see is a case of police brutality. You see that person injuring or hurting a resident in the community. We see it on social media, we see it unfold and play out, but what we don't understand is how something that could look like a vicious attack or a vicious beating on someone that seems to be doing nothing wrong, how that then is justified by the district attorney's office. So what we have to do is really start getting out and educating people on how those types of cases unfold so that we can restore the faith that people have in the criminal justice system.
What about police officers who do bad things in those situations, but bad things that are not necessarily crimes? I mean, aren't your hands tied that there's pretty much nothing you can do about that?
So, well, that's a good question. So one of the things that we have to look at, especially as we seek to reform criminal justice, right, is whether or not there are things that the district attorney should be doing independent of the police officers to look at, evaluate, and investigate acts that we feel violate a person's civil rights or violate a person's right where the conduct that the police officer is engaging in is outside the scope of their work. And whether or not it rises to the level of being an assault and battery, or whether or not it arises to the level of being an attack, as you would say. But it's one of the things that I certainly would consider in my administration, looking to see if there's a committee that we can put together that involves residents to look at some of these things, to raise and highlight some of the issues that they have so we can start to address those issues.
One of the other reasons for distrust of the criminal justice system, I imagine, is that you sometimes, especially with violent crimes, you have people who are afraid to be witnesses or even be on juries. How can you improve the situation around that?
So that's interesting that you say that. So when I was a Roxbury District Court prosecutor, found myself in an unfortunate situation of witnessing a brutal attack of a young man who had just gotten off a bus, and later learned that that individual had passed away due to his injuries. I remember being on the sidewalk as they were, the police were arriving, and then being informed that I had to go to homicide to give a statement. And when we got there, I sat in a room with two detectives. They took a statement, and at the end of the conclusion of that statement, they said, here's a piece of paper, please write down your name, your phone number, your address. And it was an uncomfortable position for me to be in, because the first question I had was, well, where does that information go? And so what we have to do is we have to make sure that, one, witnesses and victims are informed of what the process is, because no one told me exactly what was going to happen next, where my information was going to go, who would have access to it. So I think we need to do a better job of making sure witnesses feel comfortable in the process, that they understand how the process is going to work, and they understand that if they feel unsafe in the process at any time, what their rights are and what they need to do next. Because, we take it seriously protecting witnesses as well as victims, and so we need to make sure, though, that that individual understands what to do in the event that they feel unsafe, what to do in the event that they need help, and what will happen as a result of their participation in this investigation.
Another part of your legal background is that right when that bubble burst in the housing market, you started working with victims of predatory lending. Do you see yourself building on that in your work as a Suffolk County DA?
I do. One of the things I'd like to focus on is the impact that financial crimes have on our residents in the community, particularly our seniors who are a little more vulnerable. Oftentimes when I was in private practice, one of the things that I started to challenge was financial exploitation of seniors, particularly involving their own family members. And so in one situation, we had a house in Dorchester where it was the daughter who actually transferred her mother's deed into her name without her mother's knowledge, simply telling her mother that they were going to be getting new windows on the house and the house needed windows and she needed to sign a piece of paper. In fact, that paper she signed ended up being the deed to her house. Her daughter then took all of the equity out of the house and moved to another state, leaving the senior in financial ruin, but not only that, also facing a foreclosure. So it was one of those situations where I felt that that was a crime. But when you look at it from the criminal law standpoint, they would say, well, is that your signature? Did you sign it? Did you agree? And oftentimes the seniors would find themselves confused. Yes, that's my signature, but not for its intended purpose. And so for those types of crimes, I want to make sure that we're offering an avenue to prosecute those individuals who take advantage of people in that way.
Thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
Candidate for Suffolk County District Attorney, Linda Champion.